right. Hey there, everyone. Yeah, Courtney's right. This presentation is going to be different. It's going to be very quantitative, so we're going to be focusing a lot on numbers, calculations, and so we welcome any questions you have. I can tell you this is exciting. This is of all the presentations I've done since I've been at the department. I think this one's going to be my favorite, or right up there. It's also tough because I'm talking to people who calculate tax bills about how to calculate tax bills. So I welcome any questions or thoughts that anybody has. And we'll go ahead and hop into it. So just a disclaimer, this is going to be a theme throughout. You all know this every bit as well as I do. Tax bills are complicated, circuit breakers are complicated. To be able to get this into a presentation format, I've shortened certain things and simplified certain things. So I'm not necessarily going to cover every case, and I know that things are more nuanced than what we're discussing, but in general rule, we're going to go through the procedures. So we're going to start at the most basic level. We're going to start talking through how a tax bill is calculated, and then we're going to go from how an individual's tax bill is calculated to identifying what the circuit breaker credit is for an individual on their tax bill, and then we're going to wrap up at least my component of the presentation by talking about allocation of those circuit breaker credits from individual tax bills through their taxing districts to the units and funds in those taxing districts. So at the most basic level, a tax bill is calculated by multiplying a net assessed value by a tax rate and arriving at amount that a taxpayer would owe. The top part where we got to net assessed value is going to be your gross assessed value. It's passed forward by the assessor's office, subtracting away any deductions, exemptions, and abatements, and arriving at the net assessed value. So some of the common deductions that folks are going to see include standard, supplemental, mortgage, over 65. Mike Duffy. Has everyone here had a chance to meet Mike before and go through one of his presentations? Mike's going to be doing his presentation, I think, tomorrow, so he'll go in much more depth about this. But just for example's sake, I'm going to show what some of these dollar amounts are so we can think about them in the context of calculating an individual's tax bill. So for the standard deduction, that applies to where a person lives as their principal place of residence, applicable to up to an acre of land. We're going to take the lesser of 60% of their gross assessed value, or $45,000. And similarly with supplemental homestead, it's going to have the same eligibility criteria with a slightly different calculation for what the amount's going to be. Mortgage deduction is also another really common one. It's quite commonly just $3,000. There are a couple other amounts that it could theoretically be. And then we have the over 65 deduction available to older taxpayers who live within the county. So we're going to talk through tax bill for a family. I'm just calling the Smith family, who lives here in Columbus. It's two members, both of them young. The gross assessed value of their house is $100,000. They have less than an acre of land. They've got $80,000 outstanding on their mortgage. And for simplicity's sake, we're just going to assume they're an easy tax bill, and that the area where they live doesn't have too much complicated going on. So going back to our assessed value equation again, for the Smith family, we can start with what the gross assessed value is of their home. We can subtract away any deductions, exemptions, abatements that they would be eligible for or that would apply to their property, and we'll arrive at their net assessed value. So for this family, we've got the $100,000 in gross AV, we've got their standard deduction, their supplemental, their mortgage deduction, and for this particular family, they arrive at a net assessed value of $32,750. Easy enough to do for one family, but of course, in practice, we're going to be doing this for hundreds or thousands of taxpayers in a given county, so the same calculation is going to be iterated over and over and over again. The tax rate itself is the sum of tax rates for individual funds that taxing units have for the taxing district where that taxpayer resides. So tax rates are going to be expressed as a decimal. It's a decimal per $100 of assessed value. So the one we have up on the board, if they've got 1.8 for their tax rate, that means that for every $100 of net assessed value, we're assuming they're going to be paying $1.8751. So now expanding the tax bill equation just a little bit from what we looked at before, we've done the part at the top to arrive at the net assessed value. After getting to the net assessed value, we're going to bring in the tax rate and arrive at what we call the gross tax bill. And then when you subtract away any credits that taxpayer is eligible for, we have the net tax bill, or the amount that's actually going to be billed to them that we're expecting the taxpayer is going to pay. So for the Smith family, we're saying that their tax rate is 2.5124. I've got this same asterisk throughout. There's an implied division by $100 when we show this tax rate. So in reality, you could either move the decimal 2 spots over on the tax rate, or you could cut down the net assessed value by 2 spots. But for the Smith family, we arrive at a gross tax bill of $822.81. And for right now, we're saying they're not eligible for any credits. That also becomes, as things stand right now, their net tax bill, $822.81. So the full tax bill equation, running through everything that we've tackled so far and arriving at that final tax due amount, is going to be gross assessed value minus deductions, exemptions, and abatements to arrive at your net assessed value, multiplied by the tax bill, again divided by $100, to arrive at a gross tax bill, subtracting off any credits the taxpayer is eligible for, and arriving at a net tax bill amount. So far, so good? Okay. So for the Smith family, their full tax bill is going to look roughly like this. We're still showing that they owe the $822.81. If they wanted to calculate it themselves, they could certainly do so. Part of the idea behind the tax bill, once somebody gets to know the equation, is that it is possible for an individual to understand what goes into it. They can take all the inputs and come up with the outputs every bit the same as we can. So we'll talk about circuit breakers as they apply to individual taxpayers. There are 4 different types of circuit breakers that we consider. The first 3 are ones that, informally at least, we refer to as the bucket circuit breakers. That's the 1%, 2%, and 3% circuit breaker amounts. And so if you're thinking about this in terms of you being the individual taxpayer, the type of taxpayer you are, the type of property that you have is going to dictate which type of circuit breaker credit you could potentially be eligible for. So the 1% credit, that's the one we're going to think about for the Smith family. That's for homesteads. 2% residential, long-term care, agricultural, apartments commonly. 3% is going to be commercial purposes. 3% is also going to be for personal property. I should point out while we go, we can make this PowerPoint presentation available if folks would like that for notes. The one circuit breaker that at times is forgotten about when we talk about them conceptually is the over 65 circuit breaker. So there's more that goes into determining eligibility for someone who's over 65. There's an income limit, there's an assessed value limit, it's got to be on their homestead property. We've got an age circumstance, but one of the really interesting things that we find is in taxing districts that don't have bucket circuit breakers, they don't have 1%, 2%, 3% circuit breakers, they'll often still have the over 65 amount. Or we'll see cases where a taxing unit didn't expect to see any circuit breaker impact, and they see something that it tends to be relatively small compared to the bucket amounts. It's often due to the over 65 circuit breaker. So that's the one that kind of gets lost in the mix from time to time. So going back to the Smith family, the equation that we would be thinking about, again, keeping in mind that this is A homestead tax bill, this is for someone who lives at the property and is otherwise not complicated in terms of multiple uses or anything of that nature. We'd be identifying whether the gross tax bill is more than 1% of the gross assessed value. So in this case, we have $100,000 of gross assessed value. If the tax bill was over $1,000, circuit breaker would come into play. That's not the case right now for the Smith family, but there are a few different levers that we can move that would bring circuit breaker into the equation. So just kind of flipping back and forth between these two. This is the tax bill as it was before with no circuit breaker impact. I'm increasing the tax rate on this particular tax bill. So all other things are equal. It just so happens that the rate for the taxing district where they live comes to $3.50. Well, at $3.50 multiplied by the net assessed value, we now end up with a tax bill, a gross tax bill, that exceeds 1% of the gross assessed value of this taxpayer's home. And so as a result, they're going to be eligible for the 1% circuit breaker cap. The circuit breakers are automatic. There's not an application process required. There's not a form to fill out. It's calculated for everyone, and it's available to everyone. So if we wanted to think about it in terms of an either or, we're trying to decide what the net tax bill should be for a taxpayer once we've gotten to the point that we know what their gross tax bill is going to be. We can compare that gross tax bill, or what I've labeled the calculated tax bill, to what would be the maximum tax bill. So again, we're just kind of going with an easy scenario. $100,000 in gross assessed value. We're saying they're eligible for the 1% circuit breaker type. So their maximum tax bill in this case would be $1,000. We're going to be taking the lower of these two amounts. So from the taxpayer's perspective, if they were asking which one they're going to pay, they're going to pay the lower amount. In this case, their maximum tax bill, or $1,000. So if you think in terms of if statements or logical statements, I know that for me, when I put it into a construct like this one, it tends to make it easier to think about. If the calculated tax bill amount is higher than the maximum amount that taxpayer is eligible to pay, then the circuit breaker credit is going to be equal to the difference between those two numbers. On the other hand, if the maximum tax bill is higher than that calculated tax bill or the gross tax bill, there's not a circuit breaker credit for this particular taxpayer. In our instance with the Smith family, we have a calculated tax bill of $1146.25. The maximum tax bill is $1,000, so we can calculate what their individual circuit breaker amount is. In this case, $146.25. Again, the same thing is going to happen for taxpayers throughout the districts, taxpayers throughout the county. So a lot of time we'll see people, or we'll see certain tax districts if they have higher tax rates, or if they happen to have higher assessed values. We're going to see a lot of taxpayers with this being impacted by the caps. On the other hand, if you live in an area with low tax rates or often with lower assessed values, not so much of an issue. So again, this is pulling up the Smith family tax bill, and we're again showing that $3.50 tax rate. So now we've applied the circuit breaker credit of $146.25 and gotten down to the actual amount they're going to pay, which is $1,000. Does anybody have questions so far? Well, the part that we're on right now is complexity-wise not that bad. What I think we'll find is that it ends up building upon itself. So we're looking all the way down to the individual family unit right now as we go throughout this presentation. And if you think about kind of the life cycle of it from a tax and bill system perspective, or from an auditor's perspective, we're going to go from that individual taxpayer, apply it to the taxing district, and see how these little amounts end up impacting all the taxing units within the individual taxing district. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier was there are a couple different levers. So there's the tax rate as one. There's also the assessed value. So I'm going to flip back and forth for just a moment between this is the slide that we were just on with the $100,000 of gross assessed value and that $3.50 tax rate. If we go back to the original tax rate, $2.51, but we increase the gross assessed value, we can see the same type of impact. So both of those factors, the assessed value and the tax rate, can impact whether an individual is eligible for a circuit breaker credit. So these are kind of the three that I tend to think about most commonly if we're trying to identify the factors and what somebody's circuit breaker credit is, or if trying to talk conceptually with the taxpayer, looking to understand what circuit breaker credits are. Three of the really common variables are tax rate, assessed value, and then of course property type, because we're going to be looking at commercial properties different than homestead properties like we've been doing so far. So here's actually an example of a 3% gross assessed value example. So no real details, it's just a very basic example. We're going to say it's a business operating. They happen to have exactly $1 million in gross assessed value. They've got that $3.50 tax rate. Their gross and their net assessed value is going to be the exact same. In this case, they also have a tax bill that's too high relative to what they're eligible to pay, so they're going to receive a $5,000 circuit breaker credit. Any questions? Okay. Okay, so we'll start working into some of the material that's a little bit more complicated. One factor that can come into play for an individual taxpayer is exempt rates. So school referendum funds typically, or often referendum funds. One of the ideas behind circuit breakers is that taxpayers within a given area have the option to choose to raise that cap or to choose to allow a taxing unit to have a rate that's exempt from the property tax caps. And so I'm going to talk about just theoretically a school that has a 25-cent exempt rate in the instance of a tax bill that otherwise would be at the property tax cap, and identifying what the impact's going to be for that particular taxpayer. So there's a few different ways to think about this. You can kind of run at the calculations from a couple different angles, and I'm going to show a couple different ways you can think about it. So here's one. If you were to split apart that $3.50 tax rate and think about it in terms of a non-exempt rate and an exempt rate, you could calculate what's kind of the equivalent of two tax bills for this individual taxpayer. And this is, I think, a way that's really logical to think about it. So thinking exclusively about their non-exempt tax rates, we can multiply the net assessed value by that non-exempt tax rate and come up with a gross non-exempt tax bill. That's not necessarily a real phrase, but it's one that applies here. We can do the same thing with the exempt rates. So we can take that same net assessed value multiplied by the exempt tax rate for that taxing district and arrive at $81.88 that if they were billed separately would be their tax bill. So another way that you can think about it is if you wanted to just take the total rate and not worry about whether it was exempt or not exempt to figure out what the maximum amount could be. That's what we did before. That's taking the $32,750 net assessed value multiplied by the $3.50 tax rate for that taxing district, and you arrive at a gross tax bill. And then we can identify what the maximum tax bill should be for that taxpayer. So we already know that it was going to be $1,000 if everything else was equal, because they had $100,000 in gross assessed value multiplied by 1%. We also know that there's going to be this amount that we calculated on the previous slide. I'm going to flip back to it for a second. This amount we calculated on the previous slide, where we took the net assessed value multiplied by that exempt tax rate. So we can think about that as something that would go on to the top of a maximum tax bill, if you want to think of it that way. And we arrive now at a new maximum tax bill of $1,081.88. So if we wanted to figure out what the circuit breaker credit was going to be for this particular taxpayer, so we're assuming everything else is equal, their total rate's 3.5, but 25 cents is going to be exempt, we can come up with a circuit breaker credit equal to $64.37. So the credit itself is less than what the taxpayer would have had if none of the rates were exempt. The amount they pay is going to be a little bit more, And then if you want to think about it in terms of the taxing units within that taxing district, there's now going to be a taxing unit, the one that has the exempt rate, that's going to receive more in tax dollars than it otherwise would have had because it's not being impacted by that particular circuit breaker amount. So again, we have the circuit breaker amount now for one individual taxpayer, but it's going to be spread, we're going to be running the same calculation for all the taxpayers within that taxing district. So now if we wanted to go back and look at the Smith's tax bill, thinking about it in terms of this 25-cent exempt rate, we now have a lower circuit breaker credit. We also have a higher maximum tax bill, and as it turns out in this case, the taxpayer is paying the maximum tax bill, so they're going to owe throughout the course of the year $1,081.88. Does anybody have questions? Okay. All right. So that part, everything that we've run through, of course, is calculations that the county auditor runs through in their office day to day. It's a very common thing for all of you in the room. The next piece of it is one that I know county auditors also often do, but it's one that the department is also assigned with. So we produce these reports in the spring when all the abstracts come in that indicate what the circuit breaker impact is going to be for individual funds, for units within a county. And so it actually turns into really a voluminous and complex and tough calculation, but one that we run through. But at the most basic way we can summarize it, we have circuit breaker amounts that are calculated for individual taxpayers. That's everything that we just ran through for the Smith family, except for that it's going to be run 20,000 times or 100,000 times or however many apply for the given county. And then that data is going to be placed into the abstract. I mean, the abstract, if you think about it, is just a new way of displaying tax bill data alongside fund and spending data or levy data for taxing units. So within any individual taxing district, if you think about the abstract, they're going to have somewhere between $0 and theoretically infinity dollars that needs to be spread to the funds within that taxing district. And so that's what we're going to be walking through, is how that spread to the funds actually occurs. With a few exceptions, the exceptions being things like exempt funds and protected funds, as a general rule, circuit breakers are going to be spread within the taxing district proportionally based on tax rates. We'll walk through showing what that looks like. That's kind of the general idea. I can't see that well. Is the green text up there? Can you read it? Okay. So for the next handful of slides, I'm going to have two different sets of text on every slide. The blue is going to explain the concept or the idea behind what we're doing at any particular step in the circuit breaker calculation procedure. The green is going to be just one example that I pulled out that was a relatively simple one. Is Whitley County in the room? Okay, well, we can talk about them then. So I pulled out one example that's relatively simple. I'll also show you a circuit breaker report, and we've got an Excel tool that's available. I may hop in and out of that one. So you all let me know as we go along if you want more detail or if it's too detailed. I don't know. Let me know what you'd like to do as we go along. Stop me at any point. It's going to get wordy and it's going to get wonky. So this is a lot of really quantitative thinking, which is good for, of course, an audience of accountants and auditors, but also one that requires a lot of processing. So feel free to stop me at any point if you'd like to talk through anything in more detail. So we're going to walk through what I think is about 17 or 18 steps for what I'm calling county-wide circuit breaker procedures. So the very first step is determining whether a particular taxing district has circuit breaker credits. So the library that we're looking at, Peabody Library in Whitley County, it happens to operate in 4 taxing districts. I'm going to be talking about it throughout the course of this presentation. just in the context of one individual taxing district. So taxing district 14 in Whitley County does have circuit breaker credits. So taxpayers there, running through the calculations we did a few minutes ago, they're eligible for 1% credits. There are taxpayers there eligible for 2% credits. They didn't have any 3% circuit breaker credits in this particular taxing district, and they do have over 65, so they've got $268 of that. So what we have to do with these individual circuit breaker amounts, which you can pull, by the way, directly from the abstract, or you can add together individual tax bills to arrive at, what we have to do with these individual amounts is figure out how to spread them to the individual funds for the taxing units within that taxing district. So the next step we're going to do is identifying what the taxing district assessed value is. If you have the abstract, it's handy. It's just one of the columns on there. The assessed value for this particular taxing district is pretty small. It's $6 million taxing district. We're going to figure out what the levy is for each fund, and we're going to figure this out based on the abstract amounts. It can differ just a little bit from the amounts that's certified. They tend to be pretty close, but they can be just a little bit different. The formula for that is we're going to take the assessed value for that taxing district multiplied by the tax rate listed on the abstract for any particular fund within that taxing district. So for our general fund, we're taking the $6 million assessed value, multiplying it by a 10-cent tax rate, and arriving at a $6,355 levy. Similar with debt service, we're going to take the same assessed value multiplied by the tax rate, and we'll arrive at a $2,652 levy. So I've brought with me, I don't know if, have most folks in this room, have you all seen this report before, or have many of you seen this report before? This is, when I talk about the department's circuit breaker report, this is what the report looks like. They're available on DLGF's website. On the left side, there's kind of a legislation and policy section or something like that, and there's a circuit breaker information. So we run this statewide all at once. We got it up this year in early or mid-April, more or less as soon as we get all the abstracts on our hands or in our hands. But what we'll see here is up at the top, we've got the amount of circuit breaker county-wide that's going to be spread. So county-wide, they've got 1%, 2%, over 65, and then the total amount. They don't have 3% circuit breaker anywhere in the county. And then we can see for the individual taxing units, so here for instance is the county unit, we can see what the impact's going to be for the funds within that unit. So part of the reason that I brought up that we're calculating the levy based on the abstract as opposed to the certified amount was to show you where these two differences are. So here looking at it for the county, we've got 5.9 versus 6 million, so relatively close, but they can be slightly different. We might be having a technical difficulty. Do you know how to get at this? Do you know how to get at this? It's like I'm in a different kind of mode.
What's going on with it? What are they seeing? So they are not seeing that. Okay, so you are here. Let's go back to this. There you go.
Oh, it looks normal up there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It just looks different on my screen. Okay.
Oh, did that just switch to that?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we took a look at the circuit breaker report, and we calculated what the levy is based on the amounts in the abstract, which can differ just a little bit from the amount that's certified and provided on the budget order. We're also going to identify what the total rate for each unit within that taxing district is going to be. So again, this is data that you can take directly from the abstract. We've identified that Peabody Library's total rate is going to be the sum of those two rates added together, so it's close to 15 cents. All the other units, if I had the abstract up and with me, you could see that their rates all add up to be $2.29. So as the next step, we're going to figure out what the total rate's going to be for each unit for non-exempt and non-protected funds. So we're going to be filtering out our debt service funds, we're going to be filtering out referendum funds, kind of the main categories there. So again, thinking about the particular taxing unit we're working with, they have a general fund and they have a debt service fund. So their total non-exempt, non-protected rate is going to be the amount of just the one general fund, so a little over 10 cents. And then we're going to figure out what the proportional overall rate is within the taxing district for each fund, for each unit. So again, we're thinking about Peabody Library, which is just one taxing unit, more broadly within the taxing district. The individual proportional rate of that taxing unit's funds. So we've got general, which counts for something like 7/10, and we've got debt service, which counts for roughly 3/10. Doing okay so far? Okay. So one of the things that I get the most questions about, so I've done this 2 years, this coming spring will be the third year that I'm involved in circuit breaker calculations. One of the most common questions we receive, or maybe the most common question of all that we receive, is along the lines of, why did my debt service fund have circuit breaker credits, or why did my exempt fund have circuit breaker credits? Really common question. The answer is usually over 65. So over 65 circuit breakers are different from the bucket circuit breakers in that they apply to all funds regardless of exempt or protected status. And so what that means for us as folks who are calculating what these circuit breaker amounts are going to be is we have to almost think about it as two different ways. We have to think about how to spread the over 65 amount, and then we have to think separately about how to spread the bucket amounts. So for Peabody Library, we're going to figure out what its proportion of the taxing district's total tax rate is. So again, just a moment ago, when we added the two funds together, we arrived at this 14.91 cents. If we divide that by the total taxing rate for the districts, that's the second green line I have here. We're taking that fraction. The numerator in that fraction is Peabody Library's total rate. The denominator is the rate for all of the units within that taxing district. We identify that Peabody's total rate is contributing 6% or 6.1% of the taxing rate for that tax district. We can then spread the $268.64 of over 65 credits that we identified from the abstract to Peabody Library within that taxing district by multiplying the over 65 circuit breaker credit amount by that particular proportion. So we know that Peabody Library is going to see $16.40 of over 65 credit. We haven't identified, at least on step 7 yet, we haven't identified how it's going to be spread to that particular taxing unit. We just know that it's going to be spread there. And then step 8 is the next step. So we've moved from thinking about taxing units within the taxing district. Now we're thinking about funds within the taxing unit for the purpose of the over 65 calculation. So at this point, we're going to take that $16.40 and we're going to multiply it proportionally by the taxing rates for that taxing unit within that taxing district. So in this particular case, 70% roughly of the $16.40 is going to go to the general fund, and 30% roughly is going to go to the debt service fund. So within this one individual taxing district, over 65 circuit breaker amounts are going to be $11.50 and $4.80 roughly for this taxing unit. We're going to run through the same calculation for every taxing district the unit operates in. For presentation purposes, I'm just doing the one, but that's how you would do it to arrive at what the total impact on only those over 65 circuit breaker credits going to be for that taxing unit. So, questions about that part? Actually, I'm kind of curious. Do you all receive questions about that as well as I do? I know when we release reports, I probably get, I don't know, a couple dozen phone calls within the first couple days, people asking, why do we have a credit on this particular fund? Is that a question that you all receive as well? I'm seeing a few nods. For whatever reason, it's just one of those items that's out there that sometimes requires a little bit of explanation. Okay, so we've talked about the over 65 credit. Now we're going to go back to thinking about the bucket circuit breaker credits, the 1%, 2%, and 3%. So I've almost cheated by choosing an easy taxing unit because I chose one that has one non-exempt, non-protected fund. You could do the same for a taxing unit that had 2 or 10 or whatever. The math's going to be the same. But the next thing that we're going to figure out for the purpose of spreading the 1%, 2%, and 3% circuit breaker credit is the proportion of that fund's non-exempt, non-protected fund total relative to the rest of the funds for that unit within the taxing district. In this case, we're taking the general fund divided by the general fund, basically, so it's going to receive 100%. But if we had 2 funds that were of equal tax rate, we'd have 50% and 50%, and the math kind of goes on down. We're then going to identify what the total non-exempt rate is going to be for every unit within a taxing district. So Peabody Library is 10 cents plus the 4 cents, and we get $14.91. So again, the distinction between the rate we're calculating here and the one from the previous slide is that we're now accepting the fact that there's going to be protected funds in the calculation. And next we'll calculate the total non-exempt rate for every taxing district, for every unit within the taxing district. So for all other units, we have, again, $2.29. Our total non-exempt rate is going to be the $14.91 plus the $2.29 for a total district rate of $2.44. So now we're going to talk about what we're going to do with those particular rates. So for Peabody Library, this fraction is going to look very similar. It happens to be the same one as what it was for over 65. The total non-exempt rate for the district is $2.44. For the library, it's $14.91. And so the library, again, is going to be 6%. So we're going to figure out in a moment, sorry, I'm kind of skipping steps. After that, we have to figure out what total of the buckets is going to be for that particular taxing district. So we take the 1% plus the 2% plus the 3% if there was one. There's not for this particular taxing district. And we arrive at $15,000 that has to be spread among the funds of the units within that taxing district, thinking exclusively about bucket circuit breakers. Quick aside, I know I'm running through these slides kind of quickly. My plan is to go through the slides and then go back into an Excel model that shows what the calculation is. I know that many people think, well, in terms of Excel, I certainly do. And so I think that some of these ideas that I'm kind of showing now, they'll crystallize a little bit when we're actually looking at the numbers themselves. So similar to what we did with the over 65 calculation, we're going to figure out what each individual unit's share is of the taxing district's bucket circuit breaker amount based on that proportion that we just calculated. So we have $15,570 in taxing district 14 multiplied by Peabody Library's individual proportion, so roughly 6%. We arrive at $950.67. So in this case, $950.67 refers to the amount of the 1%, 2%, and 3% circuit breakers that are going to be applied to the individual funds for Peabody Library within taxing district 14. We're next going to spread that amount out, and we're going to begin by spreading it to the non-exempt, non-protected funds. So in our case, we only have one fund, the general fund. So the general fund is going to receive the entire $950.67. If we had more than one fund, we'd be spreading it proportionally by the individual fund tax rates for that unit within that taxing district. So number 16 is one that gets really complicated. It happens. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. If we exhaust the amount of circuit breaker credits that can be allocated to non-protected funds for a particular taxing unit within a taxing district, we then have to spread those amounts to the protected funds. So it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. In our case, we don't have that because the circuit breaker amount is going to be less than that levy we calculated from the abstract. But if the circuit breaker amount happened to be more than the levy abstract, what we would do is exhaust that particular fund, so its levy based on abstract AV and its circuit breaker credits would match, and then the piece of it that was remaining, we would then spread proportionally to the protected funds for that unit within that taxing district. Any questions on that part? I know it's really nuanced. Okay. And then finally, we arrive at what the individual circuit breaker impact is going to be for this particular unit within the taxing district. It's going to seem, if you're an outsider just looking at it without any real context for how it's spread, it's going to feel like we're spreading way too much to the general and not enough to the debt service. In reality, what's happening is that both funds received the over 65 circuit breaker credit. The general fund took the entire bucket circuit breaker amount. So it's going to seem really lopsided, but that's the way the calculation is designed to work. And then finally, we can take that same calculation that we just ran through and we can do the same thing for each taxing district for the county. So I mentioned earlier that Peabody Library operates in 4 different taxing districts in Whitley County. So we calculated taxing district 14. We arrived at $9.62 to the general fund and at $4.83 to the debt service fund. We're going to do the same calculation for each other taxing district within the county, and we're going to arrive at the total circuit breaker impact to Peabody Library. For its general fund, it's going to be $20,418. For debt service, it's going to be $609. I'll see if yeah, I didn't think so. I don't know if it's going to let me show you or not, but one way or another, we'd see that that same amount appears on the circuit breaker report. So I'm gonna show you an Excel model that we use. We actually have a couple different ways to calculate these circuit breaker amounts, at least at the department. So we have a tool that our developers have built that takes the abstract as an input. It runs through all these procedures to pull in the abstract data out of Excel and process it, reformat it, and pull out tax rates, and basically to run through the same calculations that we have. We also, though, have an Excel model that we use kind of manually, and it becomes a behemoth when you start adding in 92 counties worth of data. If you think about it, we're running through 92 counties worth of abstract data, at least the select pieces of it that we need. We're going through fund names and unit names, and we haven't even talked about TIFs yet, all the various exceptions that can go into circuit breakers that we haven't really covered during this presentation. It gets to be a lot. So this is what the circuit breaker report looks like. For now, it's letting it stay up on the screen. If we look at Peabody Library down at the bottom, this is kind of a summary for the unit.
Yeah, pretty much. We were actually trying to show the PDF. Okay. Where did it go? There it is.
Doing split screen, so let me change something here real quick.
Okay.
Refresh it real quick.
I have presentations in Excel. I hope it works.
We had it real quick.
Everybody huddle around the computer.
Gonna work? You get it? Okay, cool. I know something.
You know, something I did. Okay, so now that we're back up and going again, so the total impact for Peabody Library, we have the two different levy amounts: the certified levy amount, the levy based on the abstract assessed values, and then we're going to have the total circuit breaker credits. And so on this particular line, if we wanted to think about it in terms of Whitley Consolidated Schools, this particular line is going to be the total impact to the taxing unit. And then down below, we're going to break down what the impact is to each fund for that taxing unit. So for Peabody Library, we've got $21,000. It's going to be split up among the two different funds, $20,418, $609.91. And then going back to our PowerPoint presentation, we know that those two amounts are going to be the total of what happens when we add together the impact to each fund for each taxing district within the county. So one of the real takeaways that I'm really hoping to drive home when it comes to circuit breaker calculation procedures is that we think about it in terms of the individual taxing district. It's the taxing district that tends to drive most of these calculations, and often when we receive questions where people have calculated it differently, they stop accounting for the taxing district at a point sooner than what we do. So it's one of the things I really like to drive home. It's oftentimes the taxing district, and if we can get to a point where we show what the calculation was for each fund within the given taxing districts, that's the way that we can kind of troubleshoot and figure out where the difference lies. So I'm gonna pull up the Excel tool, and it's massive, and I've actually trimmed it back 90% to show what it is here. But I'd like to kind of give you an idea. If you wanted to think about calculating it manually, one way to do it, this is a tool that we use, this is a way that we do it. So we begin by pulling in select abstract data. So it's going to be the abstract data that to us is the most relevant for the calculations. So we've got the county and the taxing district code. We're going to have the total rate for that district. I'm also pulling in where we have labeled 1, 2, 3% and over 65. These are going to be the individual circuit breaker amounts for each of those individual circuit breaker types. So we see that in Whitley County there are some districts that have little or no circuit breaker. We have some districts that have a lot of circuit breaker. One common theme though, and again it goes back to that question that I receive so often, is over 65. We notice for Whitley County that every taxing district has an over 65 circuit breaker, and that's not unusual. That's something that we see pretty commonly. More or less, if you have a residential area with enough homes, chances are there's somebody that's eligible for that particular credit. But if we look at the individual taxing districts, we can identify that there are several districts that don't have any bucket circuit breaker at all. So from this point, we kind of move through a range of calculations, bouncing back and forth between thinking about it at the individual fund level and thinking about it at the taxing unit level. We also have some checks that we do to make sure that it ultimately sums out and equals the same thing that the abstract originally displayed. So this is a worksheet that identifies the individual funds within that particular county. I've just limited it to Whitley County as opposed to all 92 counties, but this is going to have all the funds for Whitley County. Process-wise, so part of what makes it so complicated for us when we use the Excel tool is the way that we have to merge together our own certified data with the data that's in the abstracts. And so I guess if we were doing it purely from an abstract perspective, we'd be pulling across the funds from the top of the abstract, but then we miss out on things like fund names, or at least the complete fund names from a DLGF perspective. Anyhow, it becomes cumbersome going back and forth between certified data and the abstract data, but that's a lot of what we do on this particular worksheet. So I've gone down to the very bottom of the page because I know that's where Peabody Library is for Taxing District 14. And I'll walk through some of the data that we have. This is the fields that serve as kind of the unique identifiers as it relates to circuit breaker calculations are going to be your county code, tax district code, unit type code, unit code, and fund code. If you were to put together one long list of those 5 pieces put together, that's a unique individual record, and I actually do that when I'm running these checks. That's an amount that serves, that's a point of reference that's going to be unique for Peabody Library within this taxing district. We then have some flags to identify if the fund is, if it's exempt or if it's protected, because we know it's going to have an impact on how the bucket circuit breakers in particular are pulled in. We have an amount that's labeled certified or abstract rate. It's really just the abstract tax rate for the individual funds. If you remember back to the presentation, the 2 amounts that I'm going over right now, those are the same as the ones that we were looking at within the PowerPoint presentation. We then pull in the abstract AV. We've got this TIF add-in. I'm kind of skipping over that one for now. And then we start running through the calculations that we have. So it's going to bounce back and forth between fund and between thinking about it as a unit. And I'll go through it now, recognizing that showing you an Excel tool is, it can be a hard way to think about it. But if you think in terms of spreadsheets like I do, and like I know many of you do, it's kind of satisfying how well it all ends up coming together. So the total unit rate within the taxing district is going to be the sum of, for Peabody Library, those 2 individual funds. If it's a unit that has 5 funds, it's going to be the sum of the 5 funds. Similarly, we're going to come up with the total unprotected and non-exempt rate. So for us, it's going to be just the rate for the general fund, the roughly 10.5 cents. What we talked about a little bit ago, figuring out the allocation of the total rate. So here in W, column W, we're thinking about the total unit rate, not the non-protected, non-exempt rate. This is where we come up with that 70% and 30% allocation. It could be completely different if you've got different funds, if you've got different tax rates. This matches up with what we saw in the PowerPoint a minute ago. So the reason that particular calculation is important, the one that we're on right now, the reason that's important is because we're going to use these allocation percentages to spread the over 65 circuit breaker within this taxing district to this taxing unit and then to the funds within that taxing unit. To figure out what the over 65 circuit breaker is, we end up going back to the abstract to pull in the data for that particular taxing district. So for us, in terms of thinking about it logically, we just kind of have a second spreadsheet set up that pulls it in. This spreadsheet is noticeably shorter than the one before it, or this worksheet is, because it doesn't have the individual funds for each taxing unit. Instead, it just has the taxing units listed for each individual taxing district. So here we've got Peabody Library, some of the amounts that we've talked about so far, figuring out what that total district rate's going to be, figuring out what Peabody Library's total percentage is going to be. So again, this is the 6% proportion that we calculated earlier, and that's taken by dividing Peabody Library's total rate by the total rate for all the units within that taxing district. We know that the over 65 for Peabody Library, or perhaps more accurately for taxing district 14, is 268.14, and we got that from the abstract. So again, this is abstract data pulled in, $268.64. So we know we're going to need to spread that out to the taxing units within taxing district 14, and we do that by the proportions that we just calculated a moment ago. So we know that 6% of those over 65 credits are going to go to Peabody Library, which is what this calculation is here. So once we have the $16.40, We will then go back and look at it from an individual fund perspective and spread the 1640 for over 65 circuit breaker to the funds for that unit within that taxing district. So here for multiplication purposes, we've shown the $16.40 on both lines. We had our proportions that we calculated earlier. Again, for over 65, we're not worrying about whether it's exempt. We're not worrying about whether it's protected. And we're calculating the same $11.57 and the same $4.83 that we did when we did it in the PowerPoint presentation a little bit earlier. So that is how we arrive at the over 65 amount for the individual taxing units, for the funds within an individual taxing district. All right, so now after thinking about how we're going to allocate the over 65 circuit breaker, then we have to go back and think about how we're going to allocate the 1%, 2%, and 3% bucket circuit breakers. So again, that's going to be done on the unprotected, non-exempt rates. For us, the line I'm highlighting right now is the general fund. The general fund is going to be 100% of the unprotected, non-exempt rate for this particular taxing district. So that's the general fund for Peabody Library. We then flip back to thinking about it from a unit perspective and identify what the total bucket circuit breaker is going to be to spread within that taxing district. To get to that point, we're going to, on the units tab, we're going to pull in the total rate for this taxing unit. For us, that's 14.91 cents. The total district non-exempt rate is the $2.44. And then just like we did with the over 65 calculation, we're going to figure out for the bucket calculation what the proportion is that's allocable to this particular taxing unit within the taxing district, 6.11%. We know that the total bucket circuit breakers, that's again the 1%, 2%, and 3%, is going to be $15,570.98 for this individual taxing district. We're going to arrive at that amount by going back to the abstract. And so it's going to be the 1%, in our case, the 1% plus the 2% gives us $15,570.98. Now we go back to the individual unit, and we're going to allocate it by that proportion, and we know that the unit's going to receive $950.67 in circuit breaker credits that then has to be allocated to the individual funds for that taxing unit within that taxing district. So now if we go back to thinking about the individual funds, we pull in this total bucket circuit breaker amount for the taxing district. We're going to multiply this by the percentage that's allocable to this particular fund. So for our case, we don't happen to have a need to spread any to protected funds. So in this case, we're basically just taking the 100% proportion because the general fund is 100% of the non-exempt tax rate for this taxing unit within this taxing district, multiplying that by the $950.67 of circuit breaker credits allocable to this unit within the district. And that's how we find out what the impact to this particular fund is going to be within taxing district 14. If we did have over that levy, so the levy amount was 65 or whatever it is for this taxing district, if the circuit breaker amount ends up being higher than that levy amount, it's at that point that we're going to start spreading it to the protected funds. Not an issue for us, but we would if we had to. Finally, to pull it all together, in terms of thinking about the individual funds, we're going to add together the over 65 circuit breaker and the bucket circuit breaker, and we arrive at the same $962.24 and $4.83 that we had within the PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to run through the same calculations, or you would run through the same calculation for all 4 taxing districts for Peabody Library if you wanted to identify what the total impact was going to be. We go ahead and set it up just to add it for ourselves for ease. What I have on this particular spreadsheet is all of the taxing units and their funds. We just kind of set up some simple sum functions that pull in what those amounts are going to be. So going down to Peabody Library, which should be close to the bottom. Peabody Library, it actually in reality has 3 funds, just the rainy day doesn't have a rate, so it's not going to factor into our calculations. For Peabody Library, we're going to have the $20,418, $20,418 and $609 in total circuit breaker credits. So with all that said, we run through this calculation for every fund, for every unit, for every taxing district, for every county in the spring. And it's something that you all can do as well, or if a taxpayer was really interested or sophisticated enough with the data and the tools and they wanted to, they could do it as well. I mean, it all runs kind of formula-based. So it's a complex set of calculations, but it's an important one, of course. It has a big impact on the counties, on the taxing units within the counties, and for an individual taxpayer, these calculations have big impact on their tax bill if they're going to receive a circuit breaker credit. Does anybody have questions about the Excel tool or the calculations that we've run through? Okay. I got just one or two more quick things, and then I'll be wrapped up. A couple quick notes. Exempt funds aren't going to receive circuit breaker credits, general rule at least, the exception being the over 65 circuit breaker credit. Same thing with protected. General rule protected funds aren't going to receive circuit breaker credits except for over 65, and then again, except for in this rare circumstance where we have to spread it because we've already spread as much as we could to the other funds for a unit within a taxing district. All right. My contact information's up here. I know that Courtney's got her piece she's going to go through as well. You want to do a break?
So for any of you who have been around a long time, you may remember that the department used to put out an Excel template that you all could use to compute the circuit breaker models. If you want, we're happy to put this out there if you want to take that back over. But it's been an interesting go, especially with the introduction of protected taxes, to figure out exactly how to do all of those calculations. I do hope that this has been helpful to you as you receive questions as well. Maybe you can see a little bit more behind the scenes of how we had gotten to where we were at. And all of this information, if you ever do have interest in seeing specific information for your county, you are more than welcome to request that. We will definitely provide you with our Excel model or any of the reports that would come out of our more automated model as well. Get started. Off the top of your heads right now, do you all have a lot of questions for us? Because it kind of will determine whether we do questions right now or whether we jump into the Lowitts. No? All right. So we've got some questions, okay? Let's go ahead, let me see. Let's go ahead, let's start with questions. That way, since you guys, if you have something on your mind, we can make sure that we address that. When it comes to the Lowitts, there's, once we go through the first calculation, parts of it get to be repetitive, so we have some ways that we can speed it up on the back end for the Lowitts. So let's go ahead and first start with any questions you may have at this point in time. Like I had said earlier, I know that there were some questions out there pertaining to TIF. You're welcome to throw any of those out at me and we'll see what I can answer. And really any other questions that you may have pertaining to things that impact the department. So if you want to go ahead and start first. I don't hide my reactions well. That is a good question. As far as I know, I believe the answer is yes. I don't believe that there are any restrictions within the TIF statutes that would prevent that. But we can definitely look into that further. But the TIF statutes don't specifically mention utilities and insurance, and not utilities and insurance, excuse me, state assessed utilities in any way, so I don't believe that it's prevented. Okay. All right. Are there other questions that you guys have at this point? Has everybody done their budget adoption? It's gone smoothly? No issues there? Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay. Well, then I guess we'll jump into Lowitz. And if you have other questions that come up, either on Lowitz or at the end of this, if you realize, oh, wait, I needed to ask this question too, we can certainly take any questions later. So what we are going to do is walk through the various LOIT calculations, and mine is all in Excel, so I apologize for some of the small print, but what I've tried to do is just really keep building on each of the slides or each of the spreadsheets. So to go along with this then, I do have a handout. If you do not have a copy of the handout, please raise your hand. We have just a few more here. I think we tried to get everybody. Okay, we've got one over here. All right. So we are going to start by going through the CAGIT formula, which I know many of you may be COIT, or you may not have either CAGIT or COIT. But this one is a good one to start with for two reasons. One, it's probably the most complex calculation that we do for the LOIT distributions. But then also, once we go through it once, there's a lot of this that is very similar that you'll see again in the COIT calculation as well as in the CDIT calculation. So the goal here of what we're trying to show is how the department takes the overall number that's certified by the state budget agency and actually breaks that down by individual taxing unit. So we had, back in August, we had our estimates that were released, and very soon you should have the October numbers. Of course, now we have been having a lot of counties who are continuing to update their LOIT rates all the way through to the end of this month. And so for those of you who have updated your rates, either at the very end of September or here in October, you'll actually receive one more certification from us in November with your updated figures. But for this purposes, what we're going to look at this point is Bartholomew County for CAGIT. First, because we're here, and second, because they're actually alphabetically the top CAGIT county. So step one of the CAGIT formula is that we're going to take a look at the current year total levies for each taxing unit. So this is just what I have shown here is all of the different taxing units that are here within Bartholomew County, and then I just have the total of their certified levy. So that's step one. All right. Step two then, what we're going to do is for the county unit, we are going to add in a welfare adjustment. And this welfare adjustment relates back to the welfare funds that the county units used to have. And on the handout, you will see what levies we're actually pulling in that are included in here. So we're going to be looking at the levy from 1999 for the former welfare fund and the welfare administration fund. And then from 2008, we're going to sum up the levies for the County Medical Assistance Towards Fund, Family and Children's Fund, Children's Psychiatric Residential Treatment Fund, County Hospital Care for the Indigent Fund, and Children with Special Health Care Needs Fund. So this total, this $4.4 million, is the overall welfare adjustment that the county is actually receiving here in Bartholomew County. To kind of show you where that number's coming from, I've got this next spreadsheet. And this shows you for each of those funds that we just talked about, here was the certified levy in the year that we actually will pull for this calculation. Now there is one little catch to this, and for most counties this won't actually impact you. For the levies from 2008, we will actually only include those levies if you had either a CAGIT or a COIT income tax rate in 2008. So there is one particular county that I know of who did not have CAGIT or COIT at that point in time. And so for them, we would only be looking at the 1999 levies. We would not actually pull in the 2008 levies. But that's just kind of an odd quirk of the system. Then from there, what we're going to do is add in the current year Cadget distributions. So both the property tax replacement credit and the current year shares. So to make this a little easier, I'm going to hide some columns here so then we can hopefully see more on screen. All right, so we had the unit name, we had the certified levies from step 1, the welfare levies from step 2, and now you'll see here that we've dropped in the 2015 PTRC and shares for each of these different units. Just to kind of give the point of reference from where that information is coming from, it's obviously just coming from our most recent reports that we did for this current year. So this is the report that we released last October for Bartholomew County. Next, we get into calculating out what portion of the debt levy is associated with bonds approved or issued after June 30th of 2005 or leases that were entered into after June 30th of 2005. This comes back to a statutory change around that time where the goal was that what we didn't want was units going out and issuing more debt and seeing a benefit in how much they're getting from their income tax dollars. So the General Assembly kind of drew this line in the sand and said, June 30th, 2005, that's going to be our line in the sand for bonds that were issued prior to that date. You actually do still get credit for those levies in this calculation. But bonds issued since that date, you do not see an additional benefit in income tax dollars because of issuing that debt. Now, there are a couple of clarifications with that. The way that the statute is actually written, it talks about when the bonds were approved, and by approved back then, they would have meant the tax control board that used to exist, where basically all of the debt issuance had to be approved by this tax control board before actually occurring. So if the debt was actually approved by tax control board by June 30th of 2005, but the bond itself was not issued until after June 30th of 2005, it would still be considered a pre-2005 debt. Likewise, what you'll see with leases quite often is that they will actually execute the lease earlier than when they actually issue the bonds. So it's possible that the lease could have been executed before June 30th of 2005, but the bond associated with that lease issued after June 30th of 2005, and it would still be considered a pre-2005 debt for the purposes of income taxes. Let's see, there's one other note that I was thinking about with this. Oh, the other note to keep in mind is as it pertains to refundings. If the original bond was issued before June 30th of 2005, but then it has since been refunded, we're still going to treat it based on its original issuance date. So if a bond was issued in 2003, refunded in 2010, the unit will still, quote, get credit for the levy associated with that particular debt. So I'm going to show you a couple of screens here that walk you through this process. And I would say this particular piece is probably one of the hardest parts of this calculation. While we try to do our best throughout our budget review time to correctly flag all of these different debts, what we end up with is about 3,500 different pieces of debt across all of the different units. So prior to doing our LOIC calculations, we'll actually sit down and go back and try to verify how they should be flagged, make sure we've indicated are they pre-2005 or post-2005 correctly. Because unfortunately, if you actually get that wrong, you can create significant shifts between the different taxing units. So I'll show you kind of how we go through this. So the first thing that we have here, this is kind of a snapshot of the Bartholomew County part of those 3,500 different rows of debt issuance that we have. So for each debt, we're going to have the unit name, we're going to have what fund it is in, that'll become important later. And then we also have the debt name as it's currently pulling out of an internal program that we have. We also then have on here, the line 1 amount, which that is really what the budget number is, or the appropriation that has been approved for that debt for the current year. You'll see then we have this column here. Is it post-2005 debt, yes or no? So we go through each of these different line items and double check that flagging and try to make sure that we've flagged everything correctly. From there, what we will do is take that information and start to aggregate it up to a fund level. So what we're going to do is take all of the different debt service funds that are within the county, and we're going to total up the appropriations that we just were looking at, the line 1 amounts, for all of the debts that we have identified as being post-2005 debt. So you'll see that right here. Then we're going to compare that to what the total certified appropriation was in that particular fund. Because we don't actually do levies by individual bond issues, this is the closest way we can get to identifying what portion of the levy is associated with post-2005 debts. So we actually are looking at your budget numbers, and then we'll show here how it gets to a levy number. So we've got your post-2005 debts, we've got the total certified budget or appropriations in this given fund for the current year. That then gets us to a percentage. So we can say what percentage of the approved budget is associated with post-2005 debt. We now pull in the certified levy for that fund, and multiplying this percentage times that certified levy tells us how much of the levy of that fund needs to be considered post-2005 debt. Lastly then, since we were looking at it at a fund level, the next step is that we'll aggregate it to a unit level. So by unit now, we will take all of those post-2005 levies we just computed and sum those all up. So what you're going to see here, let's use Harrison Township as an example. We've got $65,000 in a post-2005 levy that now needs to be applied in the LOIC calculation. So going back to kind of the first part of this, again, starting from, all right. So we've got the units, we had our levies, our welfare adjustment, our PTRC and our shares, and now we've got this post-2005 debt levy number that we're going to pull in. So here you see for Harrison Township, you see that $65,000 that we had shown on that other spreadsheet. So you'll see these kind of across the board. All right. I would say that post-2005 debt, I know I kind of started with this, but that is kind of the most time-consuming piece of our process. And if you ever are wondering how we have identified all of your different bonds, especially if you have bonds that were issued in the 04 to 06 timeframe, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to provide to you how we have everything currently categorized. You know, it definitely helps us anytime we have another set of eyes taking a look at all of this. So then, step 5 in the CAGIT formula then, we're going to move on to identifying whether or not the solid waste district is going to receive CAGIT distribution. By default, solid waste districts are not to receive income tax distributions. But the county council or the county income tax council, depending on whether it's CAGIT or COIT, they can actually decide to allocate a portion of the distribution to a solid waste district. So for all of those, we will have the solid waste district, and you'll see here I've highlighted that particular row. And now for our purposes here in Bartholomew County, they are a non-recipient. So we have flagged this as a non-recipient. That way, when we go through the rest of our formulas, it will automatically show that they should not receive dollars. If we actually had that flagged as a recipient, then they will calculate in through the rest of our calculation. All right, step 6. This is another one that gets a little hairy at times, and so we'll walk through this. I kind of have it here in summary, and then we'll actually walk through the individual calculations. So step 6 is a fire protection territory adjustment. For those of you who have a fire territory in your county, what you may be familiar with is that the entire levy for that particular fire territory, it falls with the provider unit. So the provider unit's certified levies will include the entire levy for that fire protection territory. So this adjustment, what it's trying to do is to actually break that out and say, of the total fire protection territory levy, how much of that would be attributable to the provider unit versus the participant units. So we don't actually have a fire territory here in Bartholomew County, so I have another example that I can show you. So to do this particular calculation, my example that I have here is the Delphi Fire Protection Territory from Carroll County. And so this particular fire territory came into existence, its first year was 2011. So what we're going to do in terms of figuring out how we should break the fire territory levy among the different funds, we're actually going to go back and look to see what the levies were like the year before the fire territory existed. So for this purposes, that would be for 2010. And so what we have here is these were the total unit levies in the year prior to the fire territory. So obviously Delphi 1.4 million, a significant portion of the overall levies associated with these 4 units. We will sum up this 1.658, that's just the sum of all of these amounts. And then we compute a percentage of the total levies from the year prior to the fire territory. These percentages then determine how we're going to spread the fire territory levy for the current year to all of the different units. So in this case, the fire territory levy in 2015 is $210,000. So of that, right now, if we didn't make this adjustment, Delphi would receive kind of the benefit of the whole $210,000. Because of this adjustment, we're now going to make it so that they only receive the benefit of 87% of this particular levy. So rather than having the credit of $210,000, they're only going to get the benefit of $183,000. And the participant units, they're going to now make up kind of the difference there. So Deer Creek Township, they're going to have an additional $19,000 added onto their levy. For the purposes of the LOIC calcs, Madison will get an extra $2,500. So you see here, these are our fire territory adjustments. Overall, we're going to decrease the certified levy for Delphi City by $27,000. And then the 3 other units are going to pick up that amount, all spread proportionally based on their levies prior to the fire territory. When you look at all 4 of these numbers together, the overall net adjustment is going to be 0 because we're taking it out of the provider unit and adding it to the participant units. The other thing to remember as you're doing this is that you should always see that the provider unit has a negative adjustment and the participant units are seeing a positive adjustment. So in this case, I can't actually take this and show it back on our full spreadsheet where we're looking at Bartholomew County, just because we're looking at a different county here. But all right, so again, we just continue to build this spreadsheet. So now we've dropped in a column here for the fire protection territory adjustment. If we had any of those, we would have those factored in here, both the positives and negatives. All right. Next then, this is kind of the next biggest step, and this is the culmination of the last 6 steps that we were just looking at. So for the purposes of CAGIT, the next thing we're going to do is to determine 2 different amounts. The first is the allocation amount, and then the second is the attributed allocation amount. So I actually, in the spreadsheet, or in the handout, I have shown this here. The allocation amount is going to be used to determine the property tax replacement credit spread. So you'll see these numbers come down later in the calculation. We'll actually come back to these figures. But the allocation number is going to be used for PTRC, and the attributed allocation number will be used for shares. So the differences between the two, there are 2 main differences. First, for the allocation amount, that is going to apply to all units. So we will actually compute that for all of the different units. So you'll see here in the handout, the way that we compute that is that we're going to take the current year certified levies from step 1. We will add to it the PTRC and the shares from step 3. We will subtract the post-2005 debt levies because you don't want to get credit for those levies. And then we'll also add in any of the fire protection territory adjustments, whether those are positive or negative. Once we've gone through that calculation, that will get us to our allocation amount. The key distinction then between that allocation amount and the attributed allocation amount is going to be, there's 2 different distinctions. One, your attributed allocation amount will not be calculated for schools. In a CAGIT county, schools will receive property tax replacement credit, but they will not receive certified shares. So attributed allocation will not apply to schools. And then the other big difference here is that we will add in that welfare adjustment from step 2 for the county unit. So as we go through and you compare the attributed allocation and the allocation amounts, what you should see is that a county unit's attributed allocation amount is going to be higher than their allocation amount because it's now going to include that welfare adjustment. Schools will have an allocation amount but not have an attributed allocation amount. And then all other units, the formula should work out so that they're identical. They're part of PTRC or shares in terms of what they're contributing to that calculation should be identical. So with that, I'm actually going to stop, see if there are any questions, because that's kind of the biggest chunk of this. From here, we start to roll down to breaking it out by the different the income tax dollars that we're actually receiving. So are there any questions at this point? I would say for those of you who are COIT, while some of this, especially as it pertains to PTRC, will not necessarily apply to you, a lot of these same concepts you'll see again. The welfare, the fire protection territory, the debt calculations, those all also pertain in COIT. So, all right. So, next we have a calculation that is way more complex than the benefit it actually provides, but it's called the zero levy adjustment. Basically, this is for units who do not have a certified levy at all for the given year. We don't see that happen all that often. There are a couple of towns that I know of, maybe a township here or there where this may actually apply. But the goal here with the zero levy adjustment is that even though they do not have a certified levy for that year, we want to still provide them some property tax replacement credit. So we're going to go through this process to determine how much of the property tax replacement credit they should actually receive, despite the fact that they had no levy. So to do this, switch here. To do this, what we actually end up doing is we run this spreadsheet for the entire state. So for each unit, we are going to total up their certified appropriations. We will identify the total appropriations within that particular county, and then we will compute a percentage of the total county budget that is attributable to that particular unit. So in this case, top row here, you see Bartholomew County in terms of their appropriations. They are about 13% of the total approved appropriations here in Bartholomew County. So this number then, we will end up going back and relating it into our overall calculation. And so we'll show that here. So you'll see here in column Q, we've got this, we've got the little flag here saying, is it zero levy eligible? Here in Bartholomew County, all of these are actually going to show no. None of these units did not have a levy for 2015. But if this was shown as a yes, then the percentage that we calculated, the percentage of the appropriations that we calculated, that would actually show up here in this allocation fraction or allocation percentage. And then we'll end up using that again later when we walk through the rest of this. Yeah? Just certified appropriations. Just the appropriations that come through the DLGF. All right. Next then we'll move on to step 9. This is actually calculating the amount that's available for shares and PTRC. So when you see the numbers that come from the state budget agency, which I think I have right here. So when you see this particular report come out of state budget agency, this dollar value over here, that is going to be all of the distribution that is available for both shares and PTRC. State budget agency does not break it out between shares and PTRC. So the first step that the DLGF needs to do when we're looking at that total certified distribution is to determine what portion of it will go to shares and what portion of it will go to PTRC. So per statute, the first 0.25% of the rate actually has to go to property tax replacement credit. So here in Bartholomew County, you can see here that their current CAGIT rate, base rate, is 1%. So as we are looking here, when we are trying to allocate that certified distribution between shares and PTRC, for them, we will take 0.25% of it, or 25% of the certified distribution, and we'll set that aside for PTRC. The remainder of it will be available for shares. In some instances, we have people who have or counties that have a CAGIT base rate of 0.5%. So in that case, their certified distribution actually gets split 50-50 between shares and PTRC. And then another common one that we'll see is 0.75% for the base rate. So in that case, a third of the certified distribution gets set aside for PTRC, and the remainder goes to shares. So back into our spreadsheet. Click through all these. So here you'll see that total county certified distribution of the just over $20 million for the overall CAGIT amount. 25% of that, we're showing here in column T, we're putting aside 25% of that for PTRC. So that's going to leave 15.9 or 15.1 for shares. And this $5 million will be set aside for the PTRC calculation. All right, this next step, step 10, comes back to that zero levy adjustment that we had made previously. So what we had said with that was that those units that did not have a certified levy, they were still eligible to receive property tax replacement credit. Not only are they eligible to receive property tax replacement credit, but they actually get the first cut. So what we are going to do here is take that amount that we've set aside for property tax replacement credit. So in this case, Bartholomew has the $5 million that we set aside for property tax replacement credit, which is shown here. So we're going to take that amount, and if there were any units that were supposed to receive a zero levy adjustment, we will actually identify how much to set aside here. To do that, we're going to take the PTRC total dollar amount, so this $5 million, and we'll multiply it by that percentage of the total certified appropriations that we were looking at earlier. And so whatever that portion is, we're going to set that dollar amount aside, and then everything remaining would be available for distributing to all of the other units. So typically what we will see is for those units that actually go through the zero levy adjustment, which again, there are very few that actually do this, the dollar amounts are pretty minimal. So you're not going to see a huge difference between the full property tax replacement amount versus the amount that's remaining after we account for those units. Typically we're looking anywhere from the hundreds to maybe the $4,000 or $5,000 range at most that we're setting aside. So, but it is something that we do have to kind of take off the top of our property tax replacement credit calculation. All right, now we're actually almost there. Now's the fun stuff. Now is where we take all of the different pieces that we've been looking at and actually start to get to real numbers that you all want to know. So to do this, remember from, let's see, step 7, we had said the allocation amount is the amount that is used for determining property tax replacement credit. So we're going to go down here. We've got our $5 million that's available to distribute for property tax replacement credit. So these numbers here, this allocation numerator, basically that's just going to be each individual unit's allocation amount. So if we look at this number and we can kind of work backwards to where we had step 7. So we've got the 24.7 million as the allocation amount. That now becomes our numerator for the purposes of the PTRC calculation. Our denominator for this calculation is going to be the sum of these allocation amounts for all of the units. So in this case, when you total up all of these numbers here in column Y, we're going to get to 92 million, 92.2 million. So once you have your numerator and your denominator, you can calculate a factor. So in this case, Bartholomew County is getting just under 27% of the total dollar amount that's available for property tax replacement credit. Here's that property tax replacement credit amount again, and so they will get $1.3 million in property tax replacement credit for pay 2016. And so you'll see we just kind of do that calculation all the way down the row for all of these different units. One thing you will note here, again, PTRC does apply to the schools, so you will see that the schools are receiving a portion of the property tax replacement credit. Next, then, we move on to the shares, and it's a very similar calculation. Just this time, we're going to be using that attributed allocation amount. So let's get over to the attributed allocation amount. So there's our PTRC we just calculated. So now we do the same exact thing, except we've got our numerator is now your attributed allocation amount. So remember, for the county unit, this includes your welfare adjustment. And then the schools will not have an attributed allocation amount because they are not eligible for shares. So we've got all of these numbers here. Again, sum up all of the numbers in column AD. That gets us to this 74 million, which you're going to notice that number is significantly smaller than it was previously, and that's largely going to be because the schools' allocation amounts fell off. So previously our denominator was 92 million, and now we're down to 74 million because of factoring out the schools. So same thing, compute your shares factor, multiply it by your total shares amount, $15 million. And so for Bartholomew County, for pay 2016, their shares will be just under $6 million. Clear as mud, right? It actually, again, I guess kind of going to what Matt said a couple of times, as a numbers person, I appreciate the way all of these formulas kind of fit together. Some of them can get a little cumbersome at times, especially when you're looking at that post-2005 debt and the fire territory adjustment and the zero levy adjustment. But as you kind of step through these piece by piece, all the numbers do track all the way through, which is something I greatly appreciate. So are there questions on the CAGIT, the base CAGIT formula at this point in time? All right. Have I just stumped everybody? All right. Next, what I'm going to show you, since we have done this, the next piece that we will actually compute is your public safety dollars. So in this case here in Bartholomew County, they actually don't have a CAGIT public safety at this point in time. So I'm going to switch over to, I believe, Franklin County, which Franklin, you all just adopted this. But this is how we will go through this process. So the starting point for the public safety, the CAGIT public safety formula, is going to be that attributed allocation amount that we had computed previously back in step 7 of our base formula. So we already have a lot of the work done because we've done all of those steps to get to this attributed allocation amount. Then from there, let's see. Then from there, we're going to determine the factor, which is a very similar concept to what we were just doing with PTRC and shares. Some of the differences here, and one thing to note, specifically to the department's public safety calculations. If you ever look closely at our public safety calculations at the bottom, you will see that it includes a note that this is an estimate only and it's provided for courtesy purposes. There's 2 reasons for that. One, we're actually not required to compute the public safety distributions, but the other reason for that, and the bigger reason for that, is that there is an option for your local councils or your local county income tax council to spread your public safety dollars to units that are not either the county unit or cities or towns. That is available to them. I know that there was at least one county a few years ago who was doing that. There may be others. Quite honestly, the department does not keep full tabs on that. And so when we go through and we do this public safety calculation, we are putting these out as estimates, knowing that you may have other situations locally that would modify these calculations. So if you are in a situation where your county council has decided to spread some of the public safety to a township or a fire district, something along those lines, then you should not actually rely on the department's numbers for this purpose. The general concept you can use, the calculations, going to be pretty much the same, but you would actually end up factoring in those units that are receiving public safety distributions. So for the purposes of what I'm showing here, we're assuming that that has not occurred, that all of the dollars are just going to go to either the county unit or the cities or towns. So we have the attributed allocation amounts. Again, we're going to determine what the numerator is. That's just that unit's attributed allocation amount. Add up all of those across the included units. So in this case, just the county and the cities and towns. So we get to a denominator of 8.6 million, which results in our factor. So we have our factor, and I'm sure most of you can probably make the jump to the next calculation. But now we have another nuance that we have to start factoring in this year. Under 1475 from this past General Assembly session, counties can now determine that they want to allocate either a portion of a new public safety LOIT, or an increase in your public safety rate. You can choose to allocate a portion of that to your public safety answering point, or your PSAP. So in this case, we actually do have a situation where Franklin County has chosen to allocate a portion of their public safety LOIT to their PSAP. So again, the numbers that we actually receive from the state budget agency, that's going to be this 1.27 million. They do not factor out the fact that a county may choose to allocate a portion to PSAP. So that's on our side to do that. So you'll start to see this on this next round of reports that we'll be releasing soon. So in this case, the county overall is receiving 1.27 million. $190,000 of that is going to be going to their county PSAP. This could be determined based on a percentage, it could be a dollar amount. There's a number of different ways you can actually designate how much is going to your PSAP. So once we pull that amount out, then we are left with just over $1 million that's actually available for distributing out to the units that should be receiving public safety dollars. Which that's now going to be shown here. So we have this $1 million that's available for distributing. Franklin County, they're going to get almost 73% of that. So their public safety distribution based on the department's calculations is going to be $789,000. So with that, those are the two CAGIT calculations. A lot of it is going to be very similar with COIT, and we're actually not going to walk through it in the same level of detail. I'm going to actually more just talk about the differences. So are there any questions at this point in time? All right, so let's jump over then to COIT. And like I said, I'm not going to do the step-by-step like we just did, but we'll kind of walk through and show you where it's similar and where it differs a little bit. So for COIT, my sample county here is going to be Adams County. And you'll see at the start, it starts very, very similar. So we've got the certified levies, we've got our welfare adjustment that we make, we've got our current year COIT shares that are going to each of the units, and we also have our post-2005 debt levies. All of those are calculated and dropped in the same exact way as we did on CAGIT. We have the solid waste indicator, whether they're a recipient or not. In this case, you'll see they actually are a recipient of dollars. And then we again have our fire protection territory adjustment done the same exact way that we did for CAGIT. So once we get to this place, we only come to one number this time. This time we're only going to look at what we call the allocation amount. There is no attributed allocation amount because we're not trying to make a distinction between PTRC and shares. So we just come to one allocation amount. And to get to that, it's going to be your certified levy. We will include the welfare adjustment for counties. We'll include the current year shares, subtract off the post-2005 levies, and then also include any of the fire protection adjustments that need to be made. So again, in the handout, we kind of walk through that formula. COIT is only going to be going to non-school units. So for schools, this will all show, the allocation amount will show up as 0. So we won't have to factor in schools at all during this. Then again, very similar, we have, all right. We go through the same process with that 0 levy adjustment that we had talked about earlier, determining are people eligible for it. We determine their percentage of the overall appropriations. And next we get to the certified distribution in the COIT county. So again, this is a situation where the state budget agency numbers that come out, that is a total amount. If your county is a COIT county and you also have chosen to allocate a portion of that to homestead credits, then this is where we're going to make that adjustment, is to pull out the portion of it that has to be set aside for the homestead credits. The state budget agency numbers will not automatically include that. I do want to make a distinction between this homestead credit and what we'll typically call the LOIT property tax relief credits that are available under the newer LOITs. They're two different things. This is going to be something that comes from the overall base rate for your COIT, or what you'll often hear is called your legacy COIT. We're going to break out a portion of it for this homestead credit. Now, this particular calculation itself, in terms of how we go about that, Let's see, I think there's 10 COIT counties who have COIT homestead credit, and I am happy to talk to you separately if you'd like to know how we do this. Part of the reason why I don't want to get into it too much is that the statutory formula is confusing at best. And then secondly, there are a lot of questions that are currently pending as to how the COIT homestead formula comes out under the new LOIT structure that will start in 2017. Depending on how you read the bill, it either automatically exists or it went away totally, and so that's something that I know we are looking to get clarified this next session. It is my understanding, for those of you who are a COIT homestead county, it is my understanding that the intent of 1485 was that the COIT homestead remains and that the department would make the appropriate adjustment to take a portion of your COIT rate and allocate it into the new property tax credit bucket. So that is the way that we're proceeding for the purposes of a report that we have to put out at the end of this month. But we definitely have already been talking with the General Assembly to indicate to them we're probably going to need to go back and make sure that we have this language fully clarified, because I know there's a lot of discussion and a lot of confusion as to what exactly happened to the COIT homestead credit under our new income tax scheme. And I should have started with this, but I'll say it now since I forgot it at the get-go. While we are going to a new income tax scheme come 2017, the formulas for the distribution between the units, those really have not changed. So while we're talking here under the current concept of CAGIT, COIT, and CEDIT, under 1485, the intent of 1485 from last session was that these distribution formulas remained fully in place, so that by simply taking the three individual income taxes and putting them together as one, we're not shifting dollars between units. So again, that is something that we're actually working through right now to prove out whether or not 1485 officially accomplished that. That will be available in our report that we have to provide to the General Assembly by November 1st. And once we provide that over to the General Assembly, we will also post that up onto our webpage. So it will be made available to everyone. I do expect it to help form some discussions for this upcoming legislative session in terms of what cleanups are necessary on this process, or making sure that we've fully accounted for everything. So if you've been hearing any concerns or rumblings about what's going to happen when we go to the new LOIT scheme, certainly feel free to share those with us. We talk pretty frequently with the fiscal staff over at the General Assembly, and they definitely are intent on making sure that this is as clean and as seamless as possible. So whatever you're hearing, we would love to hear that feedback as well. So kind of coming back to this spreadsheet then, we were talking about this COIT homestead amount. So Adams County actually is a COIT county that does not have this homestead credit. And so in this case, we're going to show it as 0. For those 10 counties that do have this, the amount that we're setting aside for the homestead credit, we will actually drop that in here. And what that will mean then is that this distributive shares amount would be reduced by the amount that we have set aside for the homestead credit. So we would take the state budget agency number, subtract off the amount that's being set aside for homestead credit, and then the remainder is available for actually distributing to the local units. Next, we have that zero levy adjustment comes back into play again. This is where we would determine how much of the COIT shares actually go to those units. Again, they get the first cut. And again, here in Adams County, we actually don't have any of those. So if we did, this number would be reduced by the amount that we're setting aside for those units. And then for COIT, we're going to look at their distribution numerator, which in this case is just that same allocation factor that we had computed a little earlier. Their denominator is going to be the sum of all of those allocation factors. So we get to a percentage by each unit, and then we use that to distribute out the COIT shares among each of the different units. So here in Adams County, they work out to be about 57.5% of the overall allocation factor, and so they will receive just under $2.3 million in COIT shares for 2016. So again, a lot of the same concepts, short of knocking out the property tax replacement piece of this. Between CAGIT and COIT, these calculations are very similar. You will see some differences, though, in CAGIT and COIT as it relates to public safety. Let's jump there. So on COIT public safety, here, let me hide this. The concept is very similar in terms of the math and how we work through all of these formulas, but the difference, the big difference, is going to be the starting amount. Whereas in CAGIT, we were looking at the attributed allocation amount to start. Here in COIT, we're just looking at certified levies. So the reason why that's important is that the attributed allocation amount included all of those other adjustments that we made. So it included welfare levies. It included factoring back in the current year shares and PTRC. It subtracted out debt service levies for newer debt. Here in COIT, we don't do that. We just look at certified levies. So from the standpoint, especially on the debt perspective, COIT public safety is actually an area where a unit who adds on new debt would see an increase in their public safety. So please don't go out and issue a bunch of new debt just to get more public safety. But it is an interesting distinction to be made that there is a difference in how debt is handled between CAGIT and COIT when it comes to the public safety. Again, I would say here in the new scheme that will hit in 2017, they have accounted for this. So if you were previously CAGIT, you'll continue to use the CAGIT formula for public safety. If you're currently COIT, you'll continue to use this COIT type formula for distributing public safety dollars. So they did not go to a point of where we would make everybody equal in terms of how we're determining this allocation. So here, you guys have seen this, so it's pretty easy to walk through. We've got the certified levies, that becomes our numerator. The sum of the certified levies, again, for the department's calculations, just for the county unit and the city and town units, that's going to become our denominator. We get to our factor. Here's the total certified distribution for public safety from state budget agency, 1.6 million. In this case, Adams County is not setting aside a portion to PSAP, so we just have the 0 there, so that whole 1.6 is available for distribution. And then we just multiply that number by the factors to get to each individual unit's share. So questions on COIT? See a lot of similarities, fortunately, so we didn't have to go through a whole nother set of random adjustments that we have to make. All right, we are in the home stretch, I promise. So the last one then is seated. And seated, I'm going to show you seated two different ways because it is possible to do the seated distributions one of two different ways. But fortunately, it's a much easier calc. So for seated version number 1, we're going to continue to use Adams County. And the distinction between the two different ways that we can distribute seated, one is that we can use the levies, which is very similar to what you've seen in CAGIT and COIT. You're going to be looking back at the current year certified levies in terms of distributing in terms of calculating how to distribute the money. The other option that we'll look at next is that some counties have also decided, or have decided instead of using levies, they're going to use population. So the calculation between the two is very similar. It's just kind of what starting point you're using. So in this case here for Adams County, we're going to use the levies. Again, we just drop in the 2015 certified levies. Next, we do make the welfare adjustment for the county unit. And then we also do make the fire protection territory adjustment. Let me just double check. I think this is the last adjustment. Yeah. So there's a couple of adjustments that we made on Cadgett and Coet that noticeably are not here for CEDAT. The first is that we're not adding back in what the current numbers, the current shares are. The other big one is that CEDAT does not account for post-2005 debt levies. So again, this is a situation where new debt can result in a change in income tax distributions. So. All right, then we have the state budget agency certified distribution number, just under 2.7 million here for Adams County. Now I've got these different columns in here. These are certain special legislation situations that they're not accounted for in the state budget agency numbers, so the department actually will handle those when we do our calculation. So at this point, we only have 3 counties that we're doing this for, but I left the columns in here just so you can kind of see how we actually would do this. We've got one here that's associated with Hancock County, and a portion of their CEDAT dollars actually going to help fund their library. Porter County gets 2 different adjustments, one for a portion of the overall CEDAT amount that needs to go to their local redevelopment, Regional Development Authority, and then a portion of it that statutorily is required to go to homestead credits. And then we also have in here a column, this is specifically, the heading here is a little misleading. I say Grant County here, but it's actually a more generalized special legislation that Grant County has taken advantage of. But if we have these special legislation pieces, we will factor them in here. This is one thing that will change when we go to the new LOITs, especially for Hancock County specifically. In Hancock County, that dollar amount, rather than now coming out of the way it now comes out of the economic development number, under the new scenario, it's specifically a special purpose rate. So they will see a little shift in how we actually account for their dollars. So once we factor out any of the special legislation, then we get to the total dollar amount that's available for distributing to the units. And same thing here, we're going to get to an allocation amount, which in this case is going to be that certified levy, plus the welfare adjustment, plus any fire territory adjustments. And then same thing we've been doing. That becomes the numerator. We calculate out the denominator based on the allocation amounts for the county and the city and town units. Those are the only units eligible for CEDAT dollars. Get to our factor and determine what portion of the overall CEDAT distribution is going to each of the different units. All right, one more. One more, and it's only 3 slides. All right, so this one, we're going to jump back here to Bartholomew again. Bartholomew does use the population method. So what we're going to do when we want to do the population method, first we are going to, again, identify the units that are going to be receiving CEDAT, county and cities and towns, and identify their most recent official census population. So for most units right now, we're looking back to the 2010 census figures. Some units have had special censuses since then. We would factor those numbers in, but we do not use any of the estimates that the U.S. Census Bureau will actually put out on an annual basis. We only use officially certified numbers when we're looking at population. And that's consistent through all of the different times that the department will actually use population. We have to use official population figures. So we've identified the population for each of the units. Same concept here, take that SBA number, factor out special legislation, get to the amount that's available for shares, and then just do the same thing we've been doing, numerator, denominator, get to the factor, and that determines the actual seated distribution for each of the units. So again, once you get into these, by the end, it's all very similar in terms of how you do it. It's just how you get to that number that you end up using for your numerator and denominator. So I know this was a lot of numbers. I do hope it's helpful because these are calculations that, you know, you see our report that we put out, but you never really see all the inputs that go into it. So again, as I've said a couple of times, if you ever have more questions about the inputs for your particular county or your particular unit, you are welcome to talk to us about it. We're happy to share this information with you. We will be taking and posting this up on our webpage along with Matt's presentation, so those both will be available to you. So for those who haven't been here or later on, if you want to come back as reference to it, it will be made available to you. Before we actually stop, first I want to stop and just ask, are there any other questions that we didn't get to, whether it's this or circuit breaker or anything else DLGF? So the question is, who decides whether you use levy or population? That is going to be whichever body actually established the seated. So it could be county council, or it could be the county income tax council. So one thing is, in addition to doing these calculations, we have a number of other spreadsheets that we use to actually verify, make sure everything checks out correctly. It is always nice, I'll say from the department standpoint, when counties are using population, because you pretty much can say the overall certified distribution for this county increased by 3%. Unless you have a change in the census numbers, everybody should be increasing 3%. So I like the ease associated with that one, but I'm sure that there are reasons for both. So, any other questions? All right, well then before I let you go, I believe, Gail, did you want to grab them before we wrapped up?